Chapter 8 The Hall of Legends. The quickest and most direct way for Grog and his companions to begin an ascent into the mountains north of Longdale was to climb the colossal staircase, which led to the Hall of Legends. Having rock-hewn stairs to climb made things easier, but, as Grog had been explaining since about the third step, that wasn't the same as easy. "It's my injuries," he panted to the young blonde dwarf, who sat waiting for him about halfway up. "That's the problem." The blonde dwarf, who'd introduced himself to Grog as Bimrock, said nothing. He just watched Grog approach with a thoroughly unimpressed expression on his face, and took a sip from a large copper water canister. It wasn't a total lie. Grog's head and buttock were beginning to hurt again. But he knew this didn't really explain why he was drenched in sweat, or wheezing like a lungpox-ridden dwarf on his deathbed. Bimrock offered the water canister to Grog, who held up a declining hand. "No thanks, lad. Never touch the stuff. So," he placed a hand on his chest and took a couple of heaving breaths. "The others have gone on ahead, eh?" Bimrock followed Grog's gaze up the staircase. The others were distant shapes in the last red rays of sunlight, which lanced across the southern slope of the mountain. "The Major wanted to look in on the Hall of Legends," Bimrock said. "Apparently, there's a few families taking refuge there. He asked me to wait for you. Make sure you made it up all right." "He's so caring," Grog said, before doubling over and having a quick coughing fit. Bimrock hoisted his massive backpack and settled it over his shoulders. "Let's go then." He turned and began powering up the stairs. Grog hadn't been given a backpack, but hadn't bothered questioning the others about this, as it wasn't something he'd been particularly keen to draw attention to. He just presumed that the rest of the group was carrying everything he might need, probably on account of his serious injuries. "Right behind you, lad," Grog said, despite the fact that Bimrock was already 10 steps ahead of him. By the time Grog reached the top of the gigantic staircase, his legs felt like they'd been run over by an oxen-drawn wagon, and he was puffing harder than a blacksmith's bellows. He stood hunched over with his hands on his knees, gasping for air and taking in the scene in front of him. There was a lot of activity around the entrance to the Hall of Legends. Dozens of dwarves and Kavinna, including those in Grog's party, were busily constructing a wall of stone just inside the open doors. Children were playing on the flat concourse in front of the hall, and yet more dwarves were working on the mountain slope just above the entrance, filling some kind of timber enclosure with small boulders. Grog shuffled towards the vast oak doors, trying carefully not to step on children. "You're just in time," said Major Hammerbuckle, barely glancing at Grog as he passed a rock the size of a watermelon up to a waiting Crawdis with a single hand. "I was about to send Bimrock to go and drag you up here by your beard." "What is all this about?" Grog waved a hand towards the construction. "There should be a whole battalion of reinforcements arriving tomorrow from Realm 1, the Major said, dusting his hands off and stepping towards Grog. "Their job is to escort all the refugees, all the families, anyone that wants to go and seek shelter in the High King's domain. But until then," he jerked a thumb towards the cavernous torchlit hall, "this lot just have to survive one more night, and there's no better place to hole up than here." Grog peered through the dwarf-sized gap in the thick, towering wall of stone, and a heavy breath that had nothing to do with climbing a staircase up a mountain rushed past his lips. There were scores of families inside, maybe even several hundred. They were clumped and clustered together. Meals were being cooked in iron pots over glowing fires. More children were scampering about, and a group of Kavinna were building a secondary barricade of rocks and long spears behind the main stone wall. "Sure, we'll be here tonight," Grog said. "We'll stay and help defend this place." Major Hammerbuckle shook his head. "Believe me, I want to, but I have my orders from King Brewblade. We're to push on as far and as fast as possible. We can't get caught up in the fighting. Our mission is too important." "With all due respect to the king," Grog said, not taking his eyes off the families inside the hall, "that is some cowardly bullshit." Crodus dropped down from his place on the stone wall and glared at Major Hammerbuckle with his glowing amber eyes. "I agree with the general. We should stay." "Three things," the Major said as he rounded on Crodus. "1. He's not a fucking general no more. He's just a regular dwarf. 2. When Brown asked you to go on this quest, you agreed to follow my orders. And 3. The Major looked back and forth between Grog and Crodus, and all the anger seemed to drain out of his eyes. "I know why turning your back and walking away from everyone here would be particularly unpalatable for you. But try and remember that there are tens of thousands of children across the 13 realms whose lives may very well depend on the success of our mission. We need the faith-bound, Crodus. And if we're going to get them, we need to go now." Grog watched Crodus work his jaw. The tendons in his neck flexed and strained. And then he relaxed, his blazing eyes falling downcast to the rubble-covered floor. "As you say," he grunted. Then he pushed past Grog and strode out onto the concourse. "Okay, Grog," the Major said. "We're in your hands from here on out. You be ready to lead us further up the mountain in 5 minutes, yeah?" Before Grog could answer, the Major turned and started calling for the rest of the party to abandon their wall-building efforts. "Well, well," came a voice from behind Grog. "I heard you were on your way up here, but I didn't believe it." Grog turned, saw the dwarf that had spoken, and felt like his insides had turned to water. He staggered a little and closed his eyes, but there was no unseeing the white-bearded old dwarf who was limping towards him, leaning heavily on a stick and leading a little Kvinna girl across the concourse towards him with his other hand. "Oh, no, 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 no!" Grog shouted inside his mind. He knew that the Ancient Ones had every right to want to punish him, but this latest kick to the gonads was definite proof that those ancient bastards truly hated his guts. "Look here, Gretton," said the old dwarf, pointing his makeshift walking stick squarely at Grog's chest. "This is the dwarf I've told you so much about. This is Malgrog Ironheart. We were in the army together a long time. But after I left, he went on to become a general. In fact, he was the general who bravely led your parents into the fog, along with thousands of other soldiers." Grog had stared down plague wolves and gone toe-to-toe with the Frostdrake, but he'd never in his life wanted to hide from anyone or anything as much as he wanted to hide away from the mousy little Kvinna who was peeking out shyly from behind her grandfather's ebony-striped cloak. "Grorhart, Grog's mouth had gone so dry that his words were little more than a croaky whisper. "It's good to see you." "Thankfully, the general here made it out alive," Grorhart said. "I guess that your parents were—" Grorhart swallowed hard. "Just too slow to make their way out of the fog." "I'm sorry! I'm sorry!" Grog screamed the words inside his head. "I'm sorry! I'm sorry! I'm sorry!" He imagined himself dropping to his knees in front of the little Kvinna and bursting into tears. Instead, he balled his fists, ground his teeth together, and waited for the torture to end. "I've been looking after little Gretton here. ever since her parents passed, Grog had said, limping a little closer to Grog. I do my best, but we sure do miss Mummy and Daddy, don't we, Gretchen? Gretchen nodded, never taking her glistening eyes off Grog. What happened to your leg? Grog asked, seeing the blood-stained bandages above Grorhat's left knee, and absolutely desperate to change the subject. Last night was pretty wild, Grorhat said with a shrug. Hopefully you managed to stay clear of it. No, I didn't. I went into town to help, actually. See, Gretchen? The old dwarf pointed at Grog, with mock awe on his face. Just like I said, a very brave dwarf. Hot anger rose in Grog's chest, and it was good. It burned away some of the guilt and pain. As much as I'm loving this little chat, Grog said, I'm afraid I have to go now. Me and some others are about to head deep into the northern mountains. We're going to bring back the Faithbound. We're going to help save the 13 realms. Oh, sounds exciting, Grorhat said, removing his burgundy cap and scratching his bald head. I'll be sealed off inside the Hall of Legends with little Gretchen here, praying that our defences hold against the undead hordes. Well, Ancient Ones protect you then. He began turning away, but Grorhat's gnarled old hand shot out like a striking snake and grabbed a handful of Grog's cape and mail shirt. I know what happened, the old dwarf hissed through clenched teeth. I know your secret. I know why Owen sent my son to his death. Grog tried to pull away, but Grorhat held him fast. Look at her! Grorhat inclined his head towards his granddaughter. Every time you close your eyes from now on, I want you to see this little orphan's face. I already do! Grog shouted. Then he sagged, dropping to his knees, his palms pressed against his forehead. I see her, Grorhat, he said, his voice thick and trembling. Her and 1,000 others, and all their parents. I see them in my dreams. I see them when I'm awake. I see them. I hear them. Grog looked up at the old dwarf's stern face. If what you want is a life of absolute misery for me, then you should rejoice, because that is what I have. Your misery won't bring my son back, Grorhat said. Then he let go of Grog's cloak and extended his hand to his granddaughter. Let's go, Gretchen. Let's get into the hall. Grog was still on his knees, so as Gretchen walked past him, her face passed close by his. Grog looked fleetingly into her eyes and saw not anger, maybe pity, maybe just sadness. Grandfather? The Kavinna's sweet little voice came from a few paces behind Grog. He doesn't seem like a bad dwarf. Grog closed his eyes. He doesn't seem like a bad dwarf. Come on, child, Grorhat snapped. The footsteps grew more distant, but Grog stayed kneeling on the stone concourse, letting the words echo over and over again in his head. He doesn't seem like a bad dwarf. What the fuck are you doing, Ironheart? Grog looked over his shoulder. Major Hammerbuckle was striding towards him, followed by the rest of the party. Just saying a little prayer, Grog said, getting to his feet and wiping the wetness from his eyes as subtly as he could. Don't you always say a good prayer to the Ancient Ones before embarking on a big quest? I don't have time for prayers, the Major said. There'll be enough light for at least an hour or two of marching. Bimrock! The young blonde dwarf ambled forward and held his huge backpack out towards Grog. Generous of you wanting to share, said Grog, But you can hold on to it, lad. I'm still dealing with some injuries, you know. He's not going any further, said the Major. He carried it up the stairs for you, but this is as far as he goes. This is your pack now, Grog. Grog glared at Major Hammerbuckle, but he reached out and grabbed the pack without a word. No excuses? Terrian said, arching an eyebrow. No complaints? Grog settled the pack across his shoulders. It was even heavier than it looked, and one of the straps fell right over the bruise he'd gotten from an undead bone club the night before. I don't have time for excuses, he said. Then he gave Bimrock a farewell nod and struck out towards the barely visible trail, which started just above the great doors of the Hall of Legends and led up into the mountains beyond. He doesn't seem like a bad dwarf. These words sustained Grog as he led the others up the flank of the mountain. They picked him up when he stumbled over rocks and low shrubs in the deep twilight. They were louder than the rasping of his breath and the pounding of his heart. They kept him going for well over an hour, and finally, he stopped and looked out over the moonlit valley far below. The others stopped too, dropping their packs as Grog had, and looking back the way they'd come. No one spoke. They all just stood and listened to the distant sound that was drifting up to them from the town of Longdale. It was the sound of a horn, blowing long and urgent, stabbing icicles of dread into the very marrow of Grog's bones. What do we do? Crodus asked eventually, his orange eyes burning in the darkness. Shall we go back? No, Grog said. We have to go on. He picked up his pack, turned, and resumed his exhausting trek up the mountainside. Come on, he called to the others. Follow me.